Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Parenting with Goddard webinar series. We have a really great session planned for you today focused on mental health, which is fitting because it is Mental Health Awareness Month here in May. Now, before we get started, I do have a couple of caveats I quickly want to go over. Mental health is a very broad topic, and we received dozens of questions about behavior, particularly aggression, defiance, tantrums, as well as separation anxiety, sleep. Now, we are not going to dive into all of these topics today because they were the focus of previous webinars, all of which are available on the webinar recordings page where you are currently watching this right now. So after watching today's discussion, I encourage anyone interested in those specific topics to check out those webinars below, as they are really full of great information and advice. Now let's do some quick introductions and then we'll get to the stars of our show. So I once again am Chaz Kurtz, Public Relations Manager here at Goddard, and I love these webinars for many reasons, but perhaps most of all because I'm able to take the learnings and apply them to my life at home, where I have a 9-year-old daughter, a 6.5-year-old son, and a 2.5-year-old daughter. So I said I'm not the star of the show. Let's get to those stars of the show here. So joining us once again is Dr. Lauren Loquasto, our Chief Academic Officer here at Goddard. Now, Dr. Lauren is very, very familiar with our Parenting with Goddard webinar series. She has been on just about all of them. But if this is your first time, let me quickly introduce you to Dr. Lauren. So she is a widely published author and lecturer with more than 2 decades of experience in early childhood education, including curriculum development, evaluation, and implementation, as well as teaching and consulting in the fields of preschool, special needs, and elementary education. And joining us for his second Parenting with Goddard webinar is Dr. Kyle Pruett. Dr. Kyle is a clinical professor of child psychiatry at Yale School of Medicine and a member of the Goddard School's Educational Advisory Board. Now, through his child psychiatry work, Dr. Kyle has become an international expert and forensic consultant on child, parental, and family development, paternal involvement, children's mental health and creativity, and the effects of trauma, media, and divorce on young children. So, in other words, he is the ideal expert for today's discussion. So welcome, Doctors Lauren and Kyle, and let's dive right in. Dr. Kyle, I'm going to direct the first few questions to you. So the first question, we received a few from parents that were related to this, so I kind of summed them up here into a single question. So with mental health in young children, is it nature or nurture? So in other words, are people born with specific mental health makeup, or is it influenced by their environment, or is it a combination of the two?
Thank you, Chaz. First of all, I'd like to thank people for watching. Mental health has come out of the closet as an issue in American families. We have been working on that for decades because the truth is there really is no separation between mental and physical health in the lives of our young children, who, by the way, are the real stars of this show. The well-being of your kids is very much on the bottom line for Dr. Lauren and myself. The nature versus nurture question, we all hear it when we are in high school. We're sort of thinking, wow, what makes us us? And we have come to understand through decades of research on the brain, DNA, chromosome predispositions, that it isn't nature versus nurture. It's how you nurture nature. Because each of us is a combination of a unique temperament with which we are born. Mothers know their babies. They have multiple babies. They can tell this one was a quiet one. This is going to be a troublemaker. They can just tell from the womb experience. Those are temperaments, but temperament is combined with experience. And the temperament combined with experience is what turns us into us, because experience never stops shaping us, although it is the earliest experiences that shape us the most profoundly. And that's why I'm so interested in the work of schools and institutions that work well with very young children. So forget nature versus nurture. It's how you nurture nature.
Love that. It's how you nurture nature. So Dr. Kyle, let's stick with you here. number of parents were wondering, at what age do mental health or early relational and emotional health issues either start to develop or become more present in young children?
I like the way you slipped that in there, Chaz. Mental health or early relational health. Those are two different ideas, and yet they embrace exactly the same construct, which is the way that we are nurtured, which I just said, is what shapes us eventually into who we become. So early relational health, a phrase coined by David Willis, a wonderful pediatrician on the West Coast, has really released us from thinking about infant mental health as though it's a different construct. It isn't. There is no distinction between mental and physical health in very young children. The brain growing very actively, the body growing very actively. We know by the age of 6 months that children can begin to feel overwhelmed by negative experiences in their world. Is that a mental health illness? We could call it that, but it is certainly a vulnerability that we want to address. So by whatever name you call it, we should take it seriously. It shows up as children not interested in eating or self-regulation, all physical symptoms, because they can't quite tell us what's wrong. So it's very important that we understand that there are emotional consequences for the way that we treat, deal, feed, and community around our very young children. There's no real division between body and mind. So let's not fool ourselves into thinking, that's a mental health issue, not a physical health issue. Because when children are upset that way, it is expressed through their bodies, their bodily function, their eating, their sleeping, their crying, their inability to control themselves. So we take those things seriously as early childhood interveners.
Fantastic. And I think that's a nice kind of transition, Dr. Kyle, to the next question I want to ask you, which I'm going to kind of break into 3 parts. But at the end of the day, I think dozens and dozens of the questions that we receive from parents were focused on what is normal and what is a cause for concern. And they're wanting to know that based on the specific ages of their children. So maybe we can take this question that you could probably spend 2 hours speaking about, Dr. Kyle, and we can break it into kind of 3 age groups. We'll start with infants, then move to toddlers, then finish with the kind of the pre-kindergartners, kindergartner age group. And you can speak to a little bit about kind of what is expected behavior and maybe what are warning signs when it comes to mental health. So let's start with infants, Dr. Kyle.
Well, I've always struggled with the concept of normal because as a diagnostician in the field of child and adolescent psychiatry, it's my job to draw the line between what's sort of supposedly normal and not normal. But it's not a straight line. It's wiggly. It goes back and forth over the course of the child's life. So let's not delude ourselves into thinking, oh, he's crossed the line from normal to abnormal. When we do get concerned is when a child has sort of fallen off their developmental track, because children are born to move forward. The desire for confidence is one of our biological drives. That we want to master things. And when we stop being able to master what we should in a particular age, then we run out of the reassurance and the affirmation that comes from growing up in a reasonably fine way. Infants, we worry about when they fail to what we call do the serve and return. They give us signals about what they need. They're unhappy, they're happy, they're hungry, they're very uncomfortable physically, they need to be moved, they need to be swaddled. Those are all signals they send us. When those signals stop coming and a child becomes profoundly passive and we're not getting any information from them about their internal states, that's when we worry. That's pretty rare. As a matter of fact, it's quite rare. So if it happens for a few days, don't worry about it. If it happens for a few weeks and there's something that really concerns you, and we're talking about children under the age of a year, then it's time to talk to your pediatric care provider, but we'll talk more about that in a minute.
Fantastic, Dr. Kyle. And maybe we can quickly move to toddlers and then kind of the oldest of the group we're talking about, the pre-kindergartners and kindergartners.
Toddler troubles are among the most frankly difficult to diagnose because we've unfortunately settled upon this concept of terrible twos. What it is that children are struggling to be who they are now that they're beginning to get a little control over their bodies. I love toddlers because it is the last time that the mind and the body are such good friends. The mind starts to take over, and sadly, the body recedes, and we pretend that it's all happening up here after the age of 2. So not true. Toddlers who are in trouble are toddlers who are often extremely aggressive for no particular reason. They are overwhelmed with positive, what we call positive or aggressive emotions, and they do not have a break in terms of being able to slow down, and they injure themselves, or they're injuring other people, or they're in trouble all the time, and they're not expressing. They're doing a lot of screaming instead of talking because now they do have language. Kindergartners, temper tantrums should be over by now. They should be interested in making friends. They should also be interested in mastering certain things like vocabulary and language. And if they're not doing those things, if they're cruel to animals, for example, then we do need to be seeking some help for them because their normal regulatory functions are failing them. And that will cause them a lot of trouble in the world if we don't help them then.
Great. So I think that the natural next question here then, Dr. Kyle, is if some of these concerns are identified, what should parents do? Are there specific resources that you would recommend? Or is there an age or certain situations in which seeking professional help like a therapist would be recommended?
Well, just a framing question. Dr. Lauren and I are great fans of affirming parents as the only true expert on the well-being of their children. That never changes. Now, you may get yourself into a dead end because you're so worried about what you can't understand about what's happening to a child. That doesn't mean you failed the child. What it means is this may be a little bit out of your experience. So that's the time to talk to your pediatric care provider. That's the first person you should go to and talk to. It could be a pediatrician, a physician's assistant, a pediatric nurse. But these are things you can give words to, and you can talk to them about, I'm concerned about X, Y, or Z. This has shown up. It's not going away. Can you help me? What should we do about it? Now, if you only have 8 minutes with your care provider, you won't have a lot of time to express this. So you may have to do it twice. So be persistent, be the squeaky wheel. It is worth it. That brain is growing at an astronomical rate, and you want to make sure that you get the roadblocks out of the way so that they can get back on their developmental track. And that's when it's time to raise a question with your care provider.
Fantastic. And Dr. Kyle, if those conversations with the care provider result in a recommendation to find a mental health provider for the child, do you have any recommendations or guidance for parents about the best way to find the right or the best fit of a mental health provider for their child?
A caveat. Families are very complex systems of both strengths and vulnerabilities. So sometimes it's hard to know for whom the therapy should be provided because we often are quite emotionally engaged with our children. Sometimes it's the parent that needs support. Sometimes it's the child. Sometimes it's the whole family. So when you ask for help, you don't need the burden of providing the diagnosis. Don't go to the internet and decide, oh yeah, this is what I need, and therefore look what the internet tells me. There are these people right down the road. Word of mouth, your pediatric care provider. Be cautious about coaches and counselors that do not have experience in training working with children. Since COVID, which turned the entire world of mental health provision on its head, there have been many people who have moved into this field who are not well trained to work with children because the need is so great. Some people with adult training decide, oh, they're just little people. I will take them into practice. Be cautious about that. They are not just little people. They are children with actively growing brains, emotions yet to be formed. It's quite complex. So be a little cautious. Talk to your friends. Go back to that pediatric care provider. And even if they provide someone and it doesn't work, keep going back. In-person diagnostic work is the gold standard here. Very hard to get a feel of the program that has gone off the rails online. So sometimes a hybrid experience is great, but I know it's very tough these days because we didn't, back in the 30 years ago when we knew this problem was coming, we didn't train up people, and and COVID ripped the scab off this. And I'm glad we're attending to it now. Thank you, Chaz.
That's great. Thank you, Dr. Kyle. And I think that was a great foundation for today's conversation. So I appreciate that grounding. And now, Dr. Lauren, we didn't forget about you. So I want to direct this next question to you. So lots of parents asked explicitly about anxiety. So I'd love to spend just a little bit of time on the subject. Specifically, what should parents be looking for in their young children, and how can they identify maybe what is expected or normal behavior when it comes to anxiety, and what may require some additional intervention?
It's a great question, Chaz. The reality is young children are encountering a whole new world, and they're hearing things and seeing things for the first time. And with that newness, at times can come some fears and some questions. I would caution parents to be hesitant to put a label of anxiety there. Young children are learning to deal with the unknown. And just like any other behavior, learning to walk, learning to talk, learning to ride a bike, these are skills that require practice and take time to improve upon. As young children express questions or fears or you question what's happening around them, it's very important that parents listen to what the child is saying, observe what the child is doing, and talk with your child. Provide very simple answers to their questions, reassure them of safety and presence of others, and don't overreact to the child's fear, which can unnecessarily and unintentionally provoke it. It's most important to remember that these are things that most children continue to work through. Anxiety isn't considered to be a major concern unless it's causing significant interference in the child's life for a extended period of time, at which point, to quote Dr. Kyle, you would want to talk with your pediatric care provider, but trust your instincts. It's very normal to question the unknown. And so as young children question the unknown, be there, be present, label emotions, answer their questions, and understand that for most children, the vast majority, this too shall pass.
That's great, and hopefully provide some reassurance for some parents out there. I think that response, Dr. Lauren, gets a lot to the answer to my next question here, but I'm going to go ahead and read this one. And Dr. Kyle, I'm going to direct it to you. So this was a question that a parent submitted. She said, my child is having difficulty making friends in kindergarten because of social anxiety. What should I do?
Well, I'm glad the parent's concerned. But there could be many reasons. And assigning a diagnosis of social anxiety, I know it gives you a little comfort to put brackets around this problem. But when you do that, you also seal off any understanding of what else might be going on. So, for example, have you had a conversation with a teacher? How does this look to the school versus what you're hearing from your child? Remember, our children save all of their toxic waste just for us. And we, because they trust us. Everything else, they think, the good stuff everybody else gets, but they bring it home to you. And we have to be cautious that we don't just sort of knee-jerk into a protective reaction, but we work to understand what the child is really trying to tell us. So don't rush to diagnosis. Could be many other factors contributing to it. And make sure you get all the information you can from the other observers in the child's life. It could be a problem. There could be other issues going on in her social group. There could be peers that are being either particularly difficult or particularly overwhelming in their interest in her, and she may not know quite how to handle that. Or she may not be able to sort of express what it is that she's saying about belonging to this particular group. So a lot of things could be going on. So how do you handle it? One of the things you help children do when they're socially anxious is that you model for them and you gently expose them to the things that they were afraid of, to show them this is not Armageddon. This is not the end of the world. This is the kind of thing that children learn to manage. And I did myself, so hold my hand and we're going to go in here together. We'll go as far as you want and we'll stop and we'll think about how far to go next. Role modeling, support, belief, and use of other support systems, very helpful to children.
Fantastic. I think that modeling example is a great one. And I also love that line, Kyle. I wrote it down. Children save all of their toxic waste for us, their parents. I love that. And I think that's important to remember, that what we're experiencing as parents with our children might not be what others are experiencing with them in a school setting or another social setting. So I think that's a great reminder. Dr. Lauren, let's come back to you for this next one. Can you share some helpful emotional behaviors to establish before toddlers are fully able to communicate?
That's a good question. So first and foremost, behavior is communication. So it's important that parents understand that children's behaviors are their way of communicating something to us. Even infants experience a wide range of emotions. Toddlers do as well. The most important thing that adults and caregivers can do for children is narrate what you're seeing, label emotions in the child, and label emotions in yourself. If you see your toddler getting frustrated and making fists and maybe throw a tantrum, it's perfectly appropriate to say, I see that you are frustrated. Can I help you get your shoes on, or whatever's going on in the situation? It's also very appropriate for adults to also express their own emotions themselves. So perhaps the parent is going to take care of a plant and sees that the plant has not gotten water. They can say to the toddler, I'm sad. Our plant looks so sad because it hasn't gotten enough water, and over dramatizing and labeling the emotions for the young toddler is really important. But don't underestimate their communication. Remember, verbal communication is not the only way we communicate as human beings, and certainly not the only way that children communicate. Their behavior is communication as well. Help them pair words to those behaviors.
Behaviors, communication. I love that. And it reminds me, Dr. Lauren, of some of our previous webinars focused on behavioral guidance. And I think that was a line that we heard over and over again, was those behaviors, that's their way of communicating. So I think that's a great reminder. Dr. Kyle, let's go back to you for this one. Are there differences in mental health issues between boys and girls? We'd love your thoughts on this one.
Did you get any questions about this, Chaz?
I think this is a question that you were particularly interested in answering, Dr. Kyle.
Well, I was particularly interested in the absence of questions about it.
There you go.
Yeah. I have been referred thousands of boys for behavior problems and thousands of girls for social problems, which I think speaks to what we're upset about in our culture. It does not speak to the emotional development of our children, because all of those behaviors come from the same roots. Boys and girls have very much the same emotional journey ahead of them. And that's why it's so helpful, as Dr. Lauren said, to narrate for them. When you can help a child understand what the trigger was that led to this meltdown, and you can nail it, you're going to relieve them, and you're also going to set up someone who's interested in causation and interested in why that happened. And half the time you don't know what the trigger is, but if you're lucky enough to know it and you narrate it calmly with a little back rub at the same time, you start a vocabulary for them which they can take inside and internalize, the way that Dr. Lauren talked about. So we often do that with girls more readily than we do it with boys. Not helpful to the boys. And guess what? The boys grow up and women complain that they have no emotional vocabulary. We need to do a much better job for our boys. And girls who get aggressive because they're really upset are often seen as real problems. They're not. They're working on the same emotions the boys are, but we culturally seem to want to have them behave by a different set of rules. So I'm a big fan of remembering what Dr. Lauren said: behavior is communication. And so when a boy is upset, one of the things we do know slightly is that boys, their emotions go directly to their muscles. in a way that is not true for girls. And so, or it's less true for girls. It's true for girls, but it's less true for girls. So I think when you tell a boy, my 3-year-old son, JD, collapsed one day after a big hissy fit and said, "My whole body hurts," because he had been taken over by his emotions. That was an important thing for him to understand. He wasn't in a flood of despair. He had an emotion which he couldn't manage, and it spilled over into his body. Those are things that we can help children understand, and we can help them recover from. So let's pause for a moment when we're more upset with our boys about their behavior and more upset with our daughters about their social and emotional disruptions, because they're conveying to us the same thing. They need the same kind of help. So we as adults need to revisit our triggers about their behavior.
That's great insight, Dr. Kyle. So thank you for both asking and answering that question. That was great. We received a lot of questions about separation and divorce. So let me kind of consolidate them down into just a couple. Parents want to know how best to explain divorce or separation to their young children to limit the potential mental health impact. They also want to know how to help children cope with divorce and separation. And they're wondering, are there any specific things to be on the lookout for, such as attachment issues or anxiety or depression with young children who are living in different households? So Dr. Lauren, that was kind of 3 questions in one, but I will direct that over to you.
So we know separation and divorce are an ever-present cultural phenomenon that children are dealing with. The most important thing that parents can do for their young child is limit the child's exposure to conflict. As much as possible, keep the difficult conversations between the adults out of the presence and out of the earshot of the child. It's also important to think about the number of caregivers during that transition. So as much as possible, limiting that as well, so that there's presence of familiar adults in the child's life. This is really important. It's also important that we talk with our children about what's happening in very simple, very matter-of-fact terms. Mommy and daddy are going to live in different houses, and you're going to live with mommy these days and daddy these days. We still both love you very much. Very important that children are kept in the loop. When we eliminate or avoid conversations with children about what is happening, it is common for children to assume that they are the cause of the issue or they are the cause of the conflict. That's a very normative developmental interpretation of conflict. The way we counteract that is by being upfront with our children. Again, very, very simple explanations. Let them know what's happening. Keep the conflict away from the child as much as possible, and answer their questions openly and honestly. The other thing that's really important for parents as much as possible is to try to model consistency for the child. So model, again, verbalizing emotions in very simple terms, but being a calm and ever-present presence, maintaining the routines that are normal and expected for the child as much as possible, and keeping things as consistent as possible during the transition. It is normal for young children to express themselves with behaviors during change and transition. We all do. And again, the way that adults can help children through that is by being present, speaking with them, and continuing to answer any questions that they have.
Fantastic. A lot of great nuggets in there. And I think any parents who had asked those questions, I think that very succinct response, Lauren, answered almost every question that we received about separation and divorce. So thank you. Dr. Lauren, let's stick with you here. We received a lot of questions also about managing grief in young children. Examples that we received were death of a loved one or death of a pet, moving away from friends. Can you share some tips and guidance for kind of managing grief in these young children?
So some of the tips I'm going to share, Chaz, are exactly what I just spoke about with separation and divorce.
That makes it easy.
It does. It's really about speaking with your child openly and honestly. It's also important to understand that young children process grief and death differently than adults because their world perception is different. The first time that a child experiences death in their life, they might not have a perception of what that means, or their perception might be based upon a cartoon culture, where the cartoon character dies and floats and comes back. So it's important that we speak with children in very matter-of-fact, concrete terms. Regardless of faith beliefs, it's important to explain to children that that individual or that pet has died and they will not come back. Their body does not work any longer. As opposed to saying that the dog crossed the rainbow bridge, which sounds fun and exciting. It's like something the child might want to participate in. Or has gone on to a better place, we'll see them again one day. For a young child, that's a very abstract concept. And so it's better to be very definitive and finite in our explanations of death. It's also important that parents should expect different responses than they would have from an adult or a more mature child. So for example, when informing a young child about a death, they might be very matter of fact and say, okay, and be relatively non-emotional about it. And it's important that we don't try to pressure and place our emotions onto the child, wanting them to express the same feelings that we're feeling. It's important to recognize that the child feels what they feel, the adult feels what they feel. And it's okay to say, you know, I'm glad that you were okay with this. I'm very sad because I'm really going to miss our dog. He's been in our family for a very long time. So again, acknowledge, validate, affirm the emotions of the child, but also feel free to narrate the emotions of the adult. Ask if the child has any questions and give some time and then ask again. For young children, it might also take them time to process what's happened, to process the absence, and the questions may come at a later point.
Lots of great nuggets there. Acknowledge, validate, and affirm. I thought that was great, but that entire response, Lauren, I think will be very helpful for parents who are asking those questions. Thank you. Shifting gears a little bit, in today's world, screens from TVs and computers, tablets and phones, they are everywhere. You can't escape them. So not surprisingly, we received a lot of questions about screens. So parents are wondering about the impact of tablets and screens on a young child's mental health, as well as potential warning signs that those devices may be causing problems. I think this is a great question for both of you. And Dr. Kyle, maybe we'll start with you and then transition to Dr. Lauren.
Thank you, Chaz. We don't have to ask if these devices are causing problems. We already know they are. And we don't really want to acknowledge because we use them every day in ways that we know as parents might not be best, but we just need that 5 minutes. And so here you go, plug in. But I want you to be aware of some things that are happening. One of the, we've all been concerned about the increase in anxiety and depression, particularly in adolescence. And when we look back over our the timeline for when we began to, the concern began to increase exponentially, there's a date we all stumble on, and that's 2008. And guess what also happened in 2008? It was the introduction of social media. So we dumped into our children's lives a tool we had no idea would basically start to restructure their central nervous systems. And we now have fMRI data about the way that a children's brain attends to these devices, and the message is not good. It's a level of excitement and stimulation that's quite artificial, generated by some clever engineers and program encoders that quote, turn children on to certain movements, ideas, colors, representations. And the sad thing, they look interesting, but they have absolutely zero social applications. They don't cross over into human relationships, which is what shapes us. So remember we were talking about temperament and experience. If the experience stops being human and it starts being your device, you're going to get off onto a sidetrack that will be very hard for you to get back on. And I know that's where I'm just talking about the scary stuff that happens in adolescence, but we also have been looking at data from 4-year-olds who are using devices. And already we are seeing some of these concerns and warning signs. So I don't want to be just the Dr. Doom about this. I want to be Dr. Charlie cautious about it. And how, whenever you decide that you want to make use of it, there are some, and also be a good steward of good quality exposure, because there are some things that are not destructive. We know if you could use Common Sense Media, which is a wonderful resource, they will rate programs that are good for children of certain ages and avoid the toxic ones. Very briefly, I was just on a transatlantic flight and I was next to a family where the mother and father fell asleep and the 4-year-old still has their device. And they found out how to get on. They just were tapping away. They got on the internet, and pretty soon they were watching Mad Max Fury. And that child did not sleep very well that night, as you can imagine. So we have to be especially cautious. We have to set rules from the beginning, and find ways to use them that are helpful, not destructive.
Thank you, Dr. Charlie Cautious, and over to you, Dr. Lauren.
I would underscore exactly what Dr. Kyle just said. It's important to understand that with tablets and with media, we as adults can't filter what our children are seeing. Even when we think that we've made wise choices, there are platforms and algorithms that still expose children to things that we might not be ready or prepared for them to be exposed to. And even seeing random images or things from news feeds can create some fear or anxiety in the unknown from that child. And again, if we're not aware of what they've been exposed to, there's a challenge there. The other concern I have with media and tablets for young children is it undermines what's called delayed gratification. The idea that I've got to work for something and I've got to build to it and then eventually get the outcome. Whereas on a tablet or device, as soon as I tap or touch, I get exactly what I want instantly. So when children are then made to wait or have to work for things later in childhood or in adulthood, they struggle because they're not used to that challenge. And that can have impacts in a lot of different areas, academics for one. So I would just encourage parents to think about technology and tablets as a tool, no different than a camera or a pencil or a crayon. Think about what is it doing? What am I looking to help expose or accomplish? The reality is that tablets and devices are not going anywhere. They are a tool and of our times. And so it's important that young children know what they are and understand how to navigate them, but that also means navigate them safely and navigate them with a purpose. And I would encourage parents of young children, if there is a way to do something that doesn't require a device, seek the other item, such as a tangible book where the child can flip the pages, or actually going out into nature to see an ant, as opposed to looking at an ant online, for example. Just again, challenge why you're using the device and what you're hoping to accomplish with the device, but always be vigilant and think about not just the immediate effects, but also the longer term effects.
That's great. The long-term perspective is so important to remember, as is the fact that technology and tablets, as you said, Dr. Lauren, they're tools. And with any tool, you have to use them properly to get the intended results. So great guidance there. Let's stick with you, Dr. Lauren. This should be a question that is right in your wheelhouse. What should parents and teachers consider when partnering together to support a young child who's struggling with some mental health issues?
I think you hit the nail on the head with the word partnering. It's important that as parents, if you have questions or concerns about your child's development, talk with your child's teacher and encourage your child's teacher to speak with you. Remember that you both have a shared interest in the child's success. And it's important that there's a constant dialogue back and forth about what's being observed and any questions that may take place. You asked a previous question about separation and divorce and a question about death and grieving. Those are actually great examples. The teacher might not know what's happening in the child's home, nor does the teacher need to know the ins and outs of what's happening behind closed doors. But if it's impacting the child in a way that the teacher might hear something or be able to help support consistency, for example, in the school, it's important that parents see their child's teacher as a partner. So I've encouraged families to build a relationship with your child's teacher, allow them to get to know yourself and your family and your child, but also see them as a resource when you have questions or concerns, and keep that dialogue open in both directions so that both parties can work together to optimally support the development of the young child.
Fantastic. Teamwork makes the dream work. So working together, parents in the school, so important. Parents are very eager to learn about the best practices for helping their young children develop strong social and emotional skills. We know they're eager because we receive dozens and dozens of questions related to this. So I think this might be a great one for both of you again. Let's start with you, Dr. Lauren, and then we'll go to Dr. Kyle.
So as we've discussed before, one of the great ways of doing this is by narrating for children what you're observing, narrating situations, labeling emotions in yourself and in others, even in books or in TV shows that you're watching. Actually talk about what's being seen and retell the situation by actually putting emotional labels to it. It's also important as adults that we're constantly modeling for young children what it means to demonstrate social and emotional control. So for example, when frustrated, say, I'm frustrated, I'm going to pause, I'm going to take a deep breath, and then I'm going to tell you what I need. And actually giving children coping techniques that they can then practice themselves. Maybe I'm going to count 1, 2, 3, and then respond. Maybe I'm going to, put my hands together and walk away for a moment. Whatever it is, actually give children ways to begin to help navigate emotional response, but also labeling it for them. I see that your fists are clenched and your cheeks are red and you're breathing heavy. You seem very angry right now that you can't have another cookie. So what are some ways that you can tell me that you're angry? Would it help if you yelled one time really loud? Giving children a way to begin to label the feeling, but also a way to work through it is critically important. And likewise with social situations, modeling how to be a good friend, modeling how to show respect to others, modeling how to use manners and courtesy, etc. These are all really important things. Our children are watching and they're learning by seeing what's around them. So be a good example of what you want your child to demonstrate.
Fantastic. Dr. Kyle, anything to add there?
A few things to build on, I think, but can I break ranks for a second and go back to something that Dr. Lauren talked about, partnering
By all
with
means.
teachers? I think that, especially for first-time parents, when they send their children off to school, it's very hard for them to see a teacher as a partner because they often see that teacher as someone who is going to stamp their child with going to make it, not going to make it. And those are our fears. And so it's hard to suspend that and say, okay, we're in this together. And you absolutely are in this together. So the partnership depends a lot on communication between the two of you from the get-go. So if you can get a good partnership going, and it's hard when your child comes home and calls the teacher mean, or they did something that was bad, and remember, toxic waste, get it clear before you get reactive. So I thought that was such an important, and I thought it deserved a little bit of a cheer from the sidelines about what an important concept that is. In terms of social and emotional skills, I think to focus specifically, I think a lot of our children are quite bewildered by the power of their emotions, particularly in social circumstances where they get their feelings hurt, they feel left out, they feel not just their feelings hurt, but they feel like they are being mistreated by people that they thought were their friends. And the big emotions that arise, and this can happen, 3-year-olds, even younger, are often bewildering to them. So I think what Dr. Lauren was talking about narrating, I find it myself when I see that my child is upset, I find it hard to stay calm myself. I'm very protective, and and so I'm the one that needs to take the first deep breath often before I get my child to do it. And so I think if you're one of those parents, give yourself to the time to do it, as Dr. Lauren said, walk away, whatever. And then when you come back to talk, lower the volume of your voice and speak as calmly as you can. That's tough to do when you're really upset. So practice it. And you can actually practice it with your child. They'll get a lot out of that because they see the two of you working to really make the world a better place for them to grow up. And they feel so reassured by that.
That's great. Thank you, Dr. Kyle. And we're going to move to our last question of the day. So we have very intentionally focused today's discussion on the mental health of young children. But I also do want to acknowledge that we received a lot of questions about parents' mental health. As a parent myself, I certainly know how challenging it can be, as I'm sure Dr. Kyle and Dr. Lauren, you do as well. So while we're not going to dive deep into parents' mental health today, I know both of you can recommend great resources for parents who may be seeking some assistance with their own mental health. So I think this is a nice way to close. Dr. Kyle, let's start with you, and then we'll finish with you, Dr. Lauren.
Thank you, Chaz. The distinction between parental mental health and child mental health is in many ways an artificial one. I remember in my own training as a child psychiatrist, we were supposed to have forgotten everything we know about adult development and grown-ups while we were focused purely on the children. And I found that not helpful. In fact, I went back to complain about it and changed the training of subsequent people because I didn't think it was so helpful to jump into this silo and not look over the edge and see what the real world was. So we've done this somewhat artificially in this discussion to focus on children's early well-being and health, because sometimes the parental mental health overwhelms. It's a tsunami compared to our concern about children. So we've done the opposite. Some resources that I use and that I recommend. The CDC, which can be a surprising source of good things too, as well as some troubles, have a wonderful, on their website, positive parenting tips that are quite thoughtful and helpful. I actually was part of helping to develop them. I write a blog for Psychology Today with the support of Goddard called Once Upon a Time that deals with many of these issues. It's 600 words long, it's quick, and it has, I think, some useful information to you as parents. And finally, for those of you who are further down the road of thinking about particular mental health issues that you think are developing in your child, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, the acronym is ACAP, 2 A's at the beginning, .org, has a wonderful resource called Facts for Families that will help you guide you through some questions a lot better than just Googling stuff, and it has some wonderful suggestions about what to do about what you're concerned about. So I think there are a lot more resources out there for parent mental health than there are for child mental health, but use the good ones. Thanks, Chaz.
Thank you, Dr. Kyle. Dr. Lauren, anything to add?
I would underscore use good ones. Google is a great resource, but consider your sources. Healthychildren.org, American Academy of Pediatrics, has great, very simple, easy to digest resources for parents. Would certainly encourage parents to go there. Certainly, I would encourage any parent that's feeling overwhelmed or challenged to also talk to healthcare providers as appropriate. But I would also encourage those of you that are on the webinar today to continue to follow us. The Parenting with Goddard webinar is not only these webinars that we offer on a regular basis, which are attempting to address hot topics of interest for parents today, but we also include other articles there as well. So please continue to follow us and with any questions you may have. And when you register for these webinars, we do also ask of other ideas and suggestions that you have for future webinars. So you may just well see your recommendations and your ideas on subsequent webinars. But we certainly thank you for being a part and encourage you to follow Goddard Schools as a leading provider of high quality early childhood education and always a well-rounded support for child development holistically.
Well, I can't think of a better way to close. So thank you, Dr. Lauren. Thank you, Dr. Kyle. This was very, very informative. So on behalf of all of us here today, thank you so very much for sharing your insights on such an important and at times challenging topic. So parents, you heard Dr. Lauren. Please continue to check out GoddardSchool.com for the latest Parenting with Goddard resources. So in addition to these webinars, we have a revamped blog that is continuously updated with new content, so you will not want to miss that. And we'll be back again in just a couple of months, July 31st. It will be our next Parenting with Goddard webinar, so keep an eye out for topic and registration details in early July. And until then, take care.